My name's James Farrell. If we haven't met before, I'm based in the UK and I'm a coach, professional coach, a member of the International Coaching Federation, and I'm also a chartered environmentalist. And since I came to the people and nature dimension through the environment dimension, a lot of coaches have gone the other way, and I've come from the environment side of things. So what that means for me is that I'm a strong believer in the evidence, and that is partly or largely about science, but it's also about how things feel, and sometimes the art and the craft that's involved in our work more than just the science. And I'm hoping today is going to be useful for you, whether you're a coach or whether you're a leader who would like to be more coach-like in their work. I think it's just as relevant, and in fact is relevant, I believe, to the way organizations should start to think these days. Just checking the chat in case there was a question for me. I don't think so. So, with no further ado, I'm going to start with our first section, which is this idea of starting to shift us throughout this session tonight from a more traditional coach-like state, which I think is quite egocentric. It's about I, the person, to a more ecocentric state. And I'll start with some facts and figures. More than 37,000 species on the planet are threatened with extinction. So that's 28% of all assessed species. The black little segment at the top of the diagram there are species that have already gone extinct, as far as we know, and have been able to measure. One of those, sadly, was these magnificent beasts. This is a Western African black rhinoceros that was declared extinct in 2011. And sadly, that extinction is part of a trend generally in a reduction in animal populations and biomass on this planet of 68% in the last 50 years. Some of the startling facts, I think, about this, this particular species is emblematic for me of something really prehistoric that we've lost. Its evolution predates the separation of humans from great apes in our evolutionary ladder. It used to exist across 15 separate countries, and it's largely extinct because of Homo sapiens activities, the desire for their horn, as well as encroachment on habitat. And we might think, well, that's fine, but it's a long way away, and how does it impact on us? But I think some of the story around the imperative for the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis can really be brought much closer to home. Here in the UK, we have a declining trend in the availability of green space in our towns and cities. And that's significant because there has been very good, very strong research now, including in major medical journals, that shows that the lack of access to green space actually shortens our lives. So a 10% reduction in local green space has been shown to be equivalent to approximately 5 years of life expectancy. And we know that in some of our boroughs, for example, in the London borough of Croydon, which is a large part of South London, there is a difference in life expectancy from the north to the south of that borough of 8 years. And we're just talking a few miles. And we know, and this is the story in Croydon, that there are inequities and social injustices in this story of access to green space and access to nature. If you're a Black, Asian, minority ethnic person in this country, you're twice as likely to live in a nature-deprived area. Black and minority ethnic people often have extremely small gardens, if any, outdoor space compared to white citizens of this nation. As you can see, if you track back, that is likely to mean an impact on health and quality of life and potentially longevity. So that's pretty depressing, but we lead on the whole, I believe, through hope and through active hope. And so I will tell you there is another side to this story. Um, our government Nature Conservation Agency runs a survey every month, and they measure the population's feelings about nature and nature connection. And recently they've been able to show that 83% of people surveyed, and these are large, robust pieces of work, are happier when they're in nature. And how fantastic, and don't we want our staff to be happier so they better perform? We want our clients to be happier. We also know that people who are connected to nature are much more likely, 63% more likely to have higher self-esteem. And again, people often come to coaching for reasons of low self-confidence. We know that access to nature can increase productivity. It allows us to refocus on tasks and deliver them more effectively. And that's an asset for business. And we know that people who are nature connected also have much higher life satisfaction. And I'll say more about that later on. And as a counterpoint to the story about the rhinoceros, there's a story about a beaver. And I've got colleagues here from Canada and Washington State, so you'll know about beavers. Hunted almost to extinction in Europe and Eurasia. I think at the turn of the century, they were down to about 1,200 individuals. And the fantastic story of their recovery is that now they've been reintroduced to 24 nations where they were formerly extinct. And here in the UK last week, we had our first beaver kit born in the wild in 400 years. That's fantastic because they're flippin' amazing creatures, but also because they are keystone species. They're water managers. They create wetlands that improve biodiversity, that improve water quality, and measurably lower flood risk to us. So there's lots of reasons, I believe, to have hope. So what has all of this got to do with coaching? So I use the phrase nature-based coaching. There are others available. And I think coaching can work with nature in order to help people respond not just to individual crises in their lives, but to global ones. So it can be a partnership that allows people to respond to the planet and allows the coach to respond to the person. I believe that by connecting people to the natural world, we can radically transform their capacity and their capability to realize their potential and be their best selves. And a nature-based approach can actually enhance coaching practice. And I hope to show you some examples of that and some tools of that later on in this talk. And finally, and I think most powerfully, and I'm going to come back to this at the end, well, I'd hope that this is more than the eco. This allows us to focus on more than the ego, allows us to focus also on the eco, ignite action through nature connection for people to give back to their communities and give back to the planet. And the evidence shows now that nature connected people take more action for the environment. Welcome to those that have just turned up. We are now going into a section on models, so section 2. There are 4 models that I'd like to share with you today that I use a lot and are foundational really to our understanding of human psychology and our relationship to the natural world and our place in it. The first of those, you could probably guess where we were going to start, if you know about Edward Wilson, is the biophilia hypothesis. So Edward Wilson, for those that don't know, is a Harvard biologist, a specialist in ants, an entomologist. And he developed this theory that humans have an inborn tendency to affiliate with nature. Those were the words that he used. And with his colleague Stephen Kellett, a professor from, where's he from? You'd like to say he's from Yale, I'm not sure. He developed 9 values as underpinning values for that theory, for the human experience really as part of that affiliation. And what's interesting about those values is that they include the kinds of things that have dominated our relationship with nature to date. So they include the dominionistic values. How do we control nature, for example, to protect ourselves from extreme events? What are the negativistic values that we hold? For example, the fear of dangerous animals. Some of those are valuable in evolutionary survival terms, but often have little place in the modern world. There are values for ecology and scientific exploration. So exploring the world from a scientific point of view in order to learn about it for the sake of knowledge on its own, but also in order to extract useful ingredients that we can then use, and there's a utilitarian dimension to this as well, we can use back in our lives to make our life on Earth pleasant, better, to prevent disease, etc. But what's most interesting, and we'll talk more about these other values, is there's a range of values that he identified with Stephen Kellett that are actually shown now to be linked to nature connection much more strongly than the values I've just described. So values which are aesthetic, and you think of John Muir and the national parks movement in America as a classic example of that, driven very much by the aesthetic value of those landscapes. The symbolic value of nature, the role it plays in our culture as we grow and develop. Perhaps we're losing some of that symbology as our culture becomes ever distant from the natural world. There are humanistic values and there are moralistic values. One of the underpinnings for Edward Wilson was this idea of us, or the science actually, of us evolving in Africa as a species over millions of years in a landscape which has shaped us alongside its own evolution. So I'm maybe laying it on a bit thick here, and it's perhaps something that you're very familiar with already. But essentially, we split from great apes about 6 million years ago. And the Homo erectus, which is probably the species closest to us other than Homo sapiens, they were hunter-gatherers, they could control fire. They emerged about 2 million years ago, and our species about 300,000 years ago. And we've evolved as hominids and as Homo species alongside the expansion of savanna habitat in Africa over the period on the slide there, 3 to 10 million years. And what's interesting about the savanna, as I'm sure you know, it's an open mosaic landscape. There are trees, there is grassland, there's shrubbery. It's a landscape that within which, if one is higher up especially, the ability to spot predators is really good compared to dense forests. It's a landscape that selects for the ability to spot food, to find water. And our species has evolved alongside the evolution of that landscape with characteristics that allow us to protect our young and be rewarded in evolutionary terms for that, and sense danger and be rewarded in evolutionary terms for that. And our characteristics as a species have developed alongside. So the cognition, which is particularly important for creativity and problem solving, it's one of the main reasons why we have such a big prefrontal cortex, and therefore a big head, and therefore the rest of our biology that fits around that. And the fact that we're primed for prosociality. In other words, our happiness and our well-being depends on social relationships. If you think about that time scale, the quick calculation earlier, our industrial society is about 200 years old. So if you think of that in terms of Homo erectus, which is very much like us in very many ways, we've been an industrial species for 0.01% of our evolutionary history. And if you go right back to the branch from great apes with the homini, considerably less time than that. So the basic point here, right, is we often pretend that we're somehow above or separate or different to the forces of the natural world. And in fact, we're shaped for almost our entire evolutionary history by the natural world. And therefore, being in and with the natural world is an opportunity for us to be at our best as a species. The second theory was attention restoration theory. So Kaplan and Kaplan, two psychologists, and they recognized that in cognitive psychology, the ability to focus on a task that requires effort, which is known as directed or voluntary attention, is really finite and becomes fatigued easily. Our brains are calorific, very calorific. And it's important because attentional fatigue is linked with poorer decision making and lower levels of self control. So it can lead to things like obesity. And what they postulated was that although there are lots of ways in which we can restore our attention, for example, through worship or through sleep, nature offers an extra advantage around the aesthetic advantage. So they linked back to Wilson and they linked into that aesthetic advantage. Very significant attention restoration theory, given that half the world now lives in urban areas where our attention is constantly bombarded and fatigued by the demands on our cognitive resources. The third model of four is the stress reduction theory by Roger Ulrich. And I don't know if you've heard about some of his famous experiments, but his most famous was in a hospital where he took patients who had had their gallbladders removed. And some of those patients looked out of their windows in their recovery beds onto green trees, trees in leaf. And another set of patients looked out from their recovery beds onto brick walls. And he was able to measure the difference in recovery time between those two sets of patients in a famous experiment about 35 years ago. Not only did the patients who could see the greenery leave hospital earlier, in fact, over a day earlier, and you can imagine how much money that adds up to in hospital terms. They called for fewer strong painkillers, which is better for them and better for the hospital budget. And they were far less grumpy and miserable, and the nurses didn't complain about them so much, so the staff were happier. What a fantastically simple and beautiful experiment that shows how nature can reduce stress in a way that actually enables us to heal. And this is sort of based on this idea in evolutionary terms that a stress response is evolutionarily maladaptive. In other words, it doesn't feel nice. It uses a lot of our calories and energy in fighting or running away or freezing, and we try to avoid it. And therefore, it goes back to the savanna hypothesis, which is that the kinds of landscapes we grew up in when we weren't in danger or threat from wild animals were actually non-stressful environments. And so stress reduction is about, to some extent, recreating that kind of experience again that we would have had 2 million years ago. And the fourth brings us right up to date, pretty much, nature connectedness. And Mayer and Franz, they, a bit like Wilson, but even more strongly, I think, they saw sort of humans and nature not as separate things connected across some kind of artificial boundary, but as one. So nature connectedness is about a sense of oneness with the natural world, or as they put it, an effective and experiential sense of belonging to the natural world. And I'll talk more later about nature connectedness. There is some fantastic empirical evidence behind it now, and I will also offer to you some pathways that we can use to develop nature connectedness in ourselves in our clients and in the people that we lead. So I've been talking now for about half an hour. The palette cleanser, if you've got your headphones on or you've got your speaker up loud, we're just going to just take a minute or so to listen to some sounds. Thank you. I hope you're all still with me. Can't see you at the moment, so I'm trusting that you are. We're going to go into the next part now, in which I'm going to talk about the benefits of being part of that natural world and underpinning this idea that we are part of rather than apart from nature. And I'll start with one of the grandfathers of psychotherapy, psychiatry, Carl Jung, who's a lovely quote, which I'll let you read. This idea of nature as nourishment for our psyche and also for our physical form. And there are three ways in which I'm going to describe this to you. The first is in terms of health, the second is well-being, and the third is pro-sociality. So we've known about the physical health benefits of nature for a really long time. I think the first gardens were way back in Mesopotamia, then ancient Greece, Persia. Whether we've had the science behind it or whether we've just felt it, I think we've all had a sense that nature is good for our health. And physical inactivity, for example, costs an enormous amount. Here in the UK, about £1 billion a year is spent by the NHS in fighting the physical impacts of obesity. And sadly, in 2015, the last data I have, 34% of women and 42% of women and 34% of men reported that they didn't meet the guidelines on physical activity, which obviously doesn't have to be outdoors, but predominantly we look to do that outdoors. And a landmark study by someone called Jolanda Maas in Amsterdam took a sample of 96 GP practices. There were 195 GPs and about 350,000 patients, and they tracked where those people lived and essentially when they died. And they were able to show that there were 15 clusters of disease or morbidities which were much lower, experienced much significantly less amongst those patients that lived within a kilometre of green space. Recently here in the UK, there's been a major report, I think last week, the Environmental Justice Commission, which was a citizen science and citizen jury based assessment of what we need to create a green economy and social justice and community empowerment in this country in the future. And that report has recommended that no new development should be further than 300 meters from a green space. So these findings are now edging their way into policy, if that's adopted, and will make a massive difference to the health of the nation. Loads and loads of studies, hundreds of studies now, showing, breaking down what those health impacts are. Big part of it is a reduction in anxiety and depression amongst those who have access to natural green space. And it can be as simple actually as canopy cover. So are there street trees in or near your neighbourhood? Is there nature within view of your house? An Environmental Justice Commission report has recommended that there are at least 3 aspects of the natural world on view for every new house that is built in this country. And I think it's 30% tree canopy cover in that new development as well, entirely in recognition of these health benefits. Some recent work has expanded on that actually. It's not just about quantity, it's also about quality. Having a look at where prescriptions for antidepressants were taking place versus where there was urban street tree cover, and looking at the quality of that street tree in terms of biodiversity. And they found a very strong relationship between more biodiversity, fewer antidepressant prescriptions, and particularly for deprived groups, for lower socioeconomic groups. So the next section was well-being. I mentioned that 83% of people said they were happier in nature. And usually what we mean by happier in this context is eudaimonic well-being versus hedonic well-being. And the difference being, hedonic is that sense of joy and jumping up and down with excitement, perhaps, a real rush of energy. Whereas eudaimonia is a sense of life well lived. It's a sense of life satisfaction. And we know from happiness studies that people who feel satisfied with their lives is a critical component of happiness. And people who are happy, or broadly happy, and it's not a constant state, right? We go up and down, but people who broadly call themselves happy are successful in almost every life domain. They're successful at work, in their relationships, in terms of their health and well-being. So there are over 50 studies now that show that people who are more nature connected are more satisfied with their lives, and that's almost twice as much. And that's quite incredible if you think about it, how much more that is. And that's the same across socioeconomic groups, it's the same across wealth, it's the same across age, and it's the same across gender. And we also know, as I've said before, that nature-connected people are much more likely to have higher self-esteem. And one of the reasons why all of this is thought to be the case is, in psychology, is the idea that nature meets our basic psychological needs. So perhaps going back to the savannah again, but this idea that when I'm out in nature and I feel safe, and not everybody does feel safe, that's an issue that we need to address culturally and in terms of equity in this country, and other countries, I'm sure. But should we feel safe, then actually we're autonomous. We can be more autonomous. We don't feel judged, so we can increase our sense of competence, and we're able to relate to the natural world, and also to relate to other human beings when we're together in nature. And these well-being benefits, I talked about some costs earlier on, can be really massive. There's an organisation called Fields in Trust here, and they calculated a benefit of £34 billion a year from the parks and green spaces in this country, based on measurements of life satisfaction, including physical and mental health. So these are enormous sums. If we can realise even a tiny proportion of that to invest in access to nature locally, we will save enormous amounts of money from our health service. The third area is this idea of pro-sociality. And I'll start with a quote by Henry David Thoreau, who said, we need to witness our own limits transgressed. And that to him was what nature did. It's witnessing our finiteness and perceiving something bigger, stronger, more powerful than we are. And this is the concept of awe. And that's the definition. We feel vulnerable and fragile. We feel full of respect when we're in the presence of something massive. That's me at the bottom of a Scots pine, if you can see it. There's lots of really interesting experiments around awe, particularly by Daka Keltner, who works at the UC Berkeley Greater Good Happiness Center. And what's really fascinating about awe is that it makes us more pro-social. So he did some experiments where they went into redwood groves. They were lucky enough to live in redwood groves, and dropped some wallets full of cash. People were far more likely to give the money back and find the owners under those conditions than they were in their control conditions of places without nature and without natural awe. And in fact, natural awe was greatly more significant in driving pro-social behavior than the kind of awe you would get under a skyscraper or inside a large church, for example. And so awe can actually increase generosity, increases helping, but fascinatingly, it also increases ethical decision making. So this links back to that stress reduction, this idea that when we're not stressed and we're in presence of nature, we're much more likely to have our parasympathetic nervous system engaged, our vagal nerve, which is a critical part of that nervous system. When that is engaged, we tend to orient our gaze to other humans. We tend to have our mouths relaxed so that we can talk, but also we can listen. And we're much more likely, therefore, to trust. And that, in combination with other factors, means we're more likely to make ethical decisions. So contrast that to the cliched, high-powered businessman who works in the city, long hours, stressed, tired, doesn't have that nature connection. What kind of quality of decision making is by his nature endemic? And how could we shift some of that? And what would the benefit to the planet be if we were able to connect more people in every walk of life, not just in business, to nature? The other things that we're able to show through awe is improvements in the sense of personal growth. And as coaches, isn't that what largely we do? We enable people to grow personally. Improvements in self-perceived well-being and in stress. So we're not far from another interactive section, and this is about nature connectedness itself. I'd like to start with a statement, and I'd like you to navigate, please, to Slido. Half of you agree that you often feel part of the web of life, and half of you strongly agree. That's super. I'm impressed. I wonder if how that might have been different had we had a larger sample today. But clearly, interesting choice of words, actually. Experiential. This idea that we need to experience it somehow, by which I kind of think in vivo, in real, rather than via a screen. But perhaps that can be a substitute. The sense of oneness. So senses and feelings and emotions, and this oneness, this coming together into one of the human and the natural world. Now, the tool that I'm offering you here today isn't mine. It's adapted from Lumber and Richardson, who did some work to develop and test the 9 values that Edward Wilson and Stephen Kellett developed back in the 80s, and demonstrate that there were 5 of those values that really drive that experiential sense of oneness with the natural world, that nature connectedness. So the first of those is contact, which really is about senses. So what pleasant senses do we experience when we're outdoors in nature? If we stop and ask ourselves that question, we start to open up our awareness about what time in nature means to us, which is the second thing. And perhaps not just to us, what meaning can we create for others, for our communities, for our friends, for our families? Third pathway to nature connectedness is compassion. So what action can we take in our daily lives that makes a difference? Can we make a home for nature where we live? Can we make a home for nature where we work? Emotion is the fourth one. What's the sense of calmness, enjoyment, well-being that comes, and how do we feel when we're in the presence of other humans whilst out in nature? What are the emotions that we connect to nature? One of the questions I sometimes ask in these trainings is, what were your earliest memories of nature? And again, people come up in those. So my grandfather showing me something, or my grandmother, or my mother, or my father, or my uncle, or my aunt. And so often people and the nature experience and the nature connectedness are hand in hand. And finally, the aesthetic. I talked about the importance of the aesthetic in Kaplan and Kaplan's work. It was one of the key values of Stephen Kellett and Wilson, and here expressed as beauty. So in what ways is nature beautiful to us? And how can we engage with it through art, through an other creative activity? So those are the 5 pathways to nature connectedness. And Baba Dioum, who was a forester from Senegal, who spoke at the IUCN in the late 60s, had a very famous statement that began with these words. In the end, we will only conserve what we love. And really, this is what we're talking about, isn't it? It's about, for me at least, falling in love with nature, or falling in love again with nature. And if we do that, we will care for it, we will protect it. One reading of what I've just said is a paternalistic reading, but I think if we accept that we're part of nature, then actually what we're doing is connecting our love for nature with our love for ourselves, and seeing ourselves as part of that whole piece, which I think is really quite powerful. And what Miles Richardson, who's a professor at Derby, and other colleagues have been able to show through their work is that people who fall in love with nature are nature connected, like you guys, agreeing or strongly agreeing with your sense of oneness, are much more likely to take action. So that sense that Baba Dioum shared in the 60s is now evidenced in the science. 1.7, I think it's actually 1.8, but 1.7% more pro-nature behavior declared by people who are more nature connected, and double the pro-environment behavior. So what we're talking about here are things like making a home for wildlife, volunteering, voting for wildlife-friendly policies and governments, and the environmental, broadening that out into recycling, picking up litter, managing our home energy more sustainably, and so on. So all things which, on this planet with a number of humans on it, make a considerable difference if we're able to scale up in addressing our challenges of nature and climate crisis. So what about that falling in love then? Can we get a glimpse of it perhaps by trying something in the medium that we're sharing here tonight? Some of you are outside in nature and I'm very jealous. But together we're in this virtual space. And I'd like to share with you a practice that I've developed through my other business, the Human Nature Partnership. It's a series of practices that we have for people to mindfully nature connect. And this one's called Sense Around. So if you've got headphones on, I'd invite you to pop them on. How could you fall even more deeply in love with the natural world? So I said I'd offer you another tool, and this is a tool I'm calling a mapping. I'm not sure how many of you are coaches with the ICF, or coaches at all, actually, but I think this is going to be relevant to you whether you are or not. and whether you're a leader or you work in some other leadership role. So essentially what I'm offering here is an idea which maps some concepts linked to how we work with others against the 5 pathways which you can see on the left hand side if you remember those. And at the bottom there, 4 key features of either a coach-client or a leader-staff relationship. So by building these concepts into our work as leaders or as coaches, I'm hoping that this is a tool to allow us to grow nature connection and all of its benefits, as well as actually allow us and enable us to do even deeper, richer coaching and leadership. So first is um, this foundational concept of embodying the right mindset when we go into a relationship with someone, our leader or our staff, or our coach and our client. And on that axis, there are a couple of things that we can do. For example, at the bottom there, thinking about maintaining the ability to regulate our emotions through a centering exercise, perhaps a bit like the one that we did on the screen, although we could obviously do it outside. And the ability to maintain and regulate our emotions as a coach or a leader is essential to create the right mindset for us and the right environment to work in. And then well-being. So that idea of exploring through our senses, time in nature, as we've heard, is so important for our health and well-being, is also fundamental, I think, to the coaching mindset. If we invest in our own well-being, how then can we positively role model the experience that we believe might be beneficial for our clients or those that we lead? Next, this idea of nature as a place of safety. There's ecotherapists and psychotherapists that write about this. Nature offers a place where, as we heard before, we might feel competence and autonomy and relatedness, underpinnings to that well-being. And in order to cultivate trust and safety with people, we might look to think about a compassionate view of people and a compassionate view of the natural world. And also, if any of you have done transactional analysis, time in nature is a great way of exploring our natural child. Our natural childs are often quite deeply scripted by relationships we have with parents and other adults. And it's an opportunity to experience that joy and freedom and being in the moment, open expression that we have as children that we rarely actually embody as grown-ups. And actually, cultivating the right trust and safety framework with our clients and with our staff might allow us in nature to experience that natural child again. The third axis is really about identifying new options through awareness and new awareness, and as part of that, a process of listening very deeply. And we can look at metaphor, we can look at new senses that are available to us when we work outside that are simply not available inside. Sensitivities, weather, navigation, other things that are way beyond our traditional 5 senses, and not that we use all of those very often. And then creative thinking, the idea that being in contact with nature can unlock creative thinking, which we know is so critical to evoke an awareness, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And then finally, again around that compassion axis, creating in clients options that aren't just leading to actions for themselves and they're, for example, addressing the problems that they hold for their personal crises, let's say, but by being eco-aware, creating options for them to give back to the planet that they're contingent on. So hopefully you can take that map away and think about it a bit more. I'm sure you could plot some other words on there for yourselves and play with it a bit. And in due course, I'd welcome some of your thoughts and reflections on whether it's been useful. And just to pick three examples of those intersections for you and just tell you a little bit more. So metaphor, I love a good metaphor. I'm sure you do too. Really great way to evoke awareness in people and attach meaning. So the idea of meaning that comes from nature and evoking awareness that allows us to choose from more options that we otherwise thought were possible. There's a linguist called Zoltán Kovács, who's a Hungarian, and he's a professor of linguistics, and he surveyed all of the metaphor dictionaries and research literature. And in the modern idea of metaphor, this is about concepts. And what he found was that there were 6 commonly used source domains for conceptual metaphor, and a large part of those were from the more than human world. So some of the metaphor included things like buildings, machines, and tools, but actually the most common metaphors were things that weren't about us and the things that we make. So being in nature, outside, potentially expands our palette of available metaphor, which therefore I hope and trust expands our ability to raise awareness and create meaning. Creative thinking, again about evoking awareness, and we can do that through exploring our senses, and we know that time in nature restores our attention. Kaplan and Kaplan, if you remember the attention restoration theory, what they were able to show was that time in nature allows us to reduce our emotional response, to turn off some of those busy cognitive processes at the front of our brain, activate something called the default mode network, which allows us then to return to our focused piece of work with far freer attention. There was a study amongst Danish creative professionals which showed that, so just 25 minutes in nature for the default mode network. There was a study amongst Danish creatives that showed that time being creative and thinking creatively in nature was more powerful than time in, for example, an indoor office that was nature deprived, and particularly useful in terms of the preparation and incubation phases of the creative process. So if we believe as coaches, or we believe as leaders, that we need creative thinking in the world, right? We want to innovate, we've got problems, we need to solve them, we need people to think differently, we need people to use their cognitive powers, then we can trust that time doing some of that work in nature might allow us to prepare and incubate ideas better than perhaps doing some of that work indoors, that we might be more cognitively flexible, and that we'll have a stronger working memory and ability to focus our attention. And then, last but not least, the idea that facilitating client growth links back to compassion for the planet and not just the person. And it's a positive feedback loop, really. So the more compassion we feel, the more action we take. The more action we take, the stronger our compassionate strand of our nature connectedness pathway makes us more nature connected again, and so on. And as I mentioned earlier, almost double the pro-environmental action amongst those who are nature connected, and almost double the pro-nature action amongst those who are nature connected. And in that way, we're acting for ourselves as part of nature, and also we're acting on behalf of the wider ecology. So there's a lot of material, I realise, in this session tonight, a lot for you to digest. I don't apologise for that, but I hope that it will be useful resource for you to dip into as time goes on. And I will describe in a minute some things that I'm going to share with you. But I'll just leave you with a quote. So this comes from a client of mine. This was last February. I was working with this person, and this was the last session of 6. And this person's challenge was around how they led people. And hopefully you'll see where she was able to get to. There's lots of words here, so you might want to close your eyes and just listen or follow along. I bought an apple tree with my daughter at the start of lockdown. It had one leaf on it, which we knocked off on our way back to the car. When we got home, we realised the tree had virtually no roots, but we planted it anyway. I tended it constantly, worrying about it, feeding it, talking to it. I didn't see any change. I realised then that I was trying too hard. I needed to just let go and trust the process, trust the tree to do the work and let it be, and that my role was to provide the conditions for it to grow in. So enough water and some soil. After a while, some leaves appeared. Not many, but some, and now they're buds. I'm looking forward to seeing how it carries on growing through the year, if I'll just let it.